fishing rod. That's good. Make sure you chock your wheels. If your e-brake doesn't work, even if your e-brake does work, chock your wheels. You want the car in neutral because we're going to want to set the motor to top dead center before we actually start taking things apart. First and foremost, we can start by taking off the valve cover. For those of you who have CIS, you can start disconnecting all your fuel injection stuff up there. You can take your intake box, and if you want to take the distributor out of the way, that's fine, but it's not super necessary. Once you're past all that, you can start by taking off your valve cover. You'll have to remove your throttle cable, even on CIS cars, because those do run up over the valve cover and connect to the intake manifold. Normally these are 10mm bolts holding the valve cover on. The hardware on this motor is an 11mm, but you will want either a deep 10 on a 1/4 inch ratchet or a regular 10mm with a short extension on it. Many cars you'll have a valve cover breather. Mine is that's right to atmosphere. It's my own custom anti-rust system. So once you've got your valve cover off, you can go ahead and remove your cylinder 1 spark plug, which on the 4 cylinders will be the furthest to the left. Now this can be seen as overkill. It's always best to use more than one method of checking that you're at top dead center. You can use your distributor. Always disconnect your battery too when you're in here working on things. Even if you're not really messing with anything electronic, you could always end up dropping a wrench and it could short out your starter. There's several marks you can use. Cam gears usually have a mark on them, which can always vary. So this is one of the reasons why it doesn't hurt to use multiple marks to make absolute sure you're at top dead center. I like popping the spark plug out and visually looking down into and seeing the piston and seeing it up at the top there. I don't know if you can see it, but shine a light down in there, you could see that the piston is at top dead center. Our valves are both shut on the cam side of things. So aside from using the cam gear mark itself, you can visually check the cam lobes and make sure that they're both pointed upward. We're at top dead center now. Although we are working on an ABA, if you have a counterflow 8 valve, which is where the intake and exhaust are both on the back side of the head, the process is basically identical. Before you go taking your valve cover off, go ahead and remove your intake manifold. Like I said, if you're taking the head off, you should be putting a new gasket on there while you have the head off in the first place. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, probably the hardest part about doing this job is fighting broken bolts, rusted bolts, seized bolts, stripped out, rounded off. If they've never been touched before, chances are they're seized in there pretty good from old age. If somebody's messed with the car, there's also another chance that they've rounded off or stripped or done some kind of ghetto fix. It's very rare that you'll run into no issues taking those studs and bolts off. Once you get past that, this job is very simple. You do need a few tools like a torque wrench and special bit for the head bolts themselves, but otherwise this is a very easy job. Speaking of counterflow motors, you usually have your alternator up here. Some cars will have your AC units up here. Obviously you're going to need to take that stuff off because it does bolt towards the top of the head here. So remove your alternator, get all that stuff out of the way, basically get everything disconnected from the head itself. I'm going to go ahead and remove my carburetors and then the exhaust manifold. And one of the things you could do so that you don't have to deal with rusted, seized, rounded off hardware is upgrade to this ARP stuff. This hardware is a couple years old already and comes off like it's brand new. There's no corrosion on it. I don't have to use any anti-seize. It's definitely worth spending the money on it if you're thinking about it, or if you know you'll be regularly taking this all apart. like my stupid self. Once you take your intake manifold off on the counterflow heads, you have easier access to the exhaust, where you can fight old exhaust studs and corroded bolts and stuff with a little more room and leverage. You know, if you reach a stripped out one, have more room to get a pair of vice grips in here. Definitely recommend taking the intake manifold off regardless. So I apologize if there's stuff that you run into while doing this on your CIS 1.8, 1.7, 1.6 liter or gas motor, and something's different, or you find something that's in the way. This just happens to be the car that I have right now that needs a head swap. So, but this ARP hardware is really nice too, because aside from it coming off really nice and easily and hassle-free, it's reusable. I've reused this hardware more than once now, and it's still perfectly good. That's what it's designed to be used for. If you're going to keep using the stock hardware though, you do need to know that those factory nuts are one-time use, or so they say. I have reused them in the past, but it is best to buy new ones. It's like $4 worth of hardware. You know, get it while you're getting the head gasket. Little crush lock nut sort of deals. If you have a factory exhaust manifold and stuff, you might have that toilet bowl set up, which sucks to deal with. That's unbolted and ready to come off. Once I unbolt the head, it should slip right out. Before we could do that though, we do have to drain the coolant, which you could do at the beginning of all this. It really doesn't matter. If the car's hot, obviously wait to do it so you can let it cool down a bit, but we're going to drain from the water pump area so you get as much coolant out as possible, so you don't make as much of a mess when you pop the head off. Otherwise, when you pop the head off, you'll get coolant gushing everywhere, all over your driveway. I'm gonna go jack the car up, start draining the radiator. While the coolant's draining, we go ahead and loosen up the timing belt. So should be a 17 mil on that tensioner there. You don't have to take it all the way off, but we are not replacing the timing belt on this motor, so we can go ahead and just leave that like that. I am replacing this. I don't know how old it is. It feels pretty good, but it's a cheap part. Cheap insurance to change it out. Do have a new one here. It's a couple bucks. Change it out. Timing belt's out of the way. Everything on the front side and back of the motor is disconnected. Now on the driver's side of the motor, especially for those of you still running heat, you'll have this whole setup here with your cooling system. And in most cases, you'll have a ground strap for your ignition system. So that's what I'm disconnecting up front here. Make sure that goes back on. We put the head back on. While we're on this side of the motor, or by the transmission at least, there is another timing spot to check here. And the reason why I didn't bring this up is because in the past I've had flywheels that were installed wrong, or the wrong flywheels installed, where the timing marks were nowhere to be found where they should have been. And there's a certain reason for that, which we won't really get into, but I personally don't like to rely on that timing mark. And with the last fiasco that happened with bending the valves on the billet head, I no longer rely on the mark that I have down here on the accessory belt. You could probably see that white paint mark and that notch there. If you line that up with a certain spot, that works too. But when you shear the crank pulley like I did, that mark will line up. Everything up here will look good. Your pistons won't be where they're supposed to be. That's why I will always remove a spark plug and visually check that the pistons are where they're supposed to be. You can never go wrong with that technique. Use the other marks as backups. Again, this is all just my personal preference, so take it with a grain of salt. Back to this coolant flange over here on the driver's side of the motor. Once you crack that loose, you'll hear more coolant leak out sometimes, so always keep that drain pan under wherever you have your... So I didn't really show you where I'm draining it from, but more or less from the bottom of the water pump there. You can see where I have that screwdriver hanging out, because I didn't totally disconnect the hose. I don't want it all come flying out, but basically at the bottom of that water pump there is where I drain it anytime I'm doing something like this, or anytime I need to drain it. One of the biggest differences with the carburetor setup versus CIS is all the different vacuum lines and a couple extra sensors and wires. but it's still the same idea. Disconnect everything from the head. Basically look around and see what's connected to the head, what's going to get in the way. If you have an old car with brittle lines and you don't want to deal with replacing them all, you should be taking that stuff apart and getting it out of the way just in case. The more room you make when working on things, the better off you'll be and the less stuff you'll break. Lastly, we've got a coolant line on the back of the ABA head here. Pretty typical for ABAs. Non-ABAs, this line runs to the radiator there, so doesn't really get in your way. These reusable Mark III style, I believe they're called, Mark III valve cover gaskets are the way to go. They're reusable. The other style are the cork gaskets, which are single use. You do need longer studs for that, but they sell it all as a kit on Tectonics. Go check them out. We're all disconnected on this side too, so the head is totally free and disconnected from everything. Grab your breaker bar. You'll need an extension if you don't get this bit as a longer extended one, but this is a M12 triple square something or another. If you look up Mark 1 head bolt socket triple square whatever, it'll pop right up. Now whenever removing a head, it's the same as install, same thing like the cam. Work from the middle out, and this is more so with the head because the cam only has 15 foot-pounds of force on it. The head bolts have a lot more pressure on them than that, so you're going to want to do this in steps. If you just go taking the bolts out without doing it the way I'm about to show you, you can warp the head. So what I'll do is I'll break them free, get that crack. Again, work from the middle. Go like a quarter turn after you crack them. So it's just like putting a wheel on. You want to go crisscross. This isn't the way that the bolts are supposed to go on, the pattern I'm doing right now, so make sure you stay tuned to see the actual pattern. This is kind of a junk head, so it's not as important. I'm going to keep it as a spare, so I don't want to take any unnecessary risks at the head getting warped. Once you get to about a half turn, they'll start spinning freely. But again, take your time. So these are all basically loose and turning by hand now. Now these head bolts I reused 3 times now. I mentioned in one of the last videos, it is okay to reuse your head bolts if you're in a pinch. Again, not recommended. The truck was burning more oil than it should the last 2 months that I've been driving it with the reused head bolts and head gasket. It's safe to assume it's going to be a combination of both of those and not just one or the other. You know, if you're in a pinch and you have to reuse your head bolts, but you have a new head gasket, okay, you know, not the end of the world. Other people have done it. But if you don't know if those head bolts have already been reused before you got the car, question if you absolutely have to reuse them. Chances are you probably don't. In my scenario, I wasn't going to spend $100 on hardware and gaskets just to take this head back off 2 months later. It's what makes these cheap cars very expensive when you do stuff like that. So I'm going to do myself a favor and throw these head bolts right in the garbage where they belong, because they've been used at least 3 times during my ownership. And I did not buy these ones new, so who knows. Just like that, comes off. It's super important that your mating surfaces are nice and clean. Take a fresh razor. Even though this is really clean, I'm just going to go over it, make sure there's no high spots, nothing, no gunk. Yeah, see, we've got some gunk built up here. That's probably where oil was getting passed. This metal does see high temperature, and if you've got a head gasket that failed, which is why you're taking your head off in the first place, you're definitely going to have gunk built up. So take your time, prep this surface. When you're using the razor blade, don't cut down into it. You want to just lightly graze at a very shallow angle, get any of the big stuff off. You're not going to use a razor blade to make it a mirror finish. Just run over everything, feel for any high spots. Take your Scotch-Brite. Same thing, don't go crazy digging into it, just give everything a quick wipe. I don't know why there's oil in there, but check all your threads. If you want to go crazy, get in there with the tap and chase the threads out. But personally, as long as you're not doing too much cleaning and going all willy-nilly with getting dirt everywhere, the thread should be nice and clean from taking your old head off. If you want, take one of your old bolts and check each spot, make sure it spins in nice and freely. But personally, I try to not touch any of that. The less you touch it, the less likely, unless you touch it or unless you work around it, the less likely you are to get dirt and grime stuck down in those threads. Because if you get too much stuff down in there, you will have trouble getting a proper torque on the bolts. Now, if it were more than 2 years since I last went over this, I'd be spending a lot more time. But this is really smooth, even though it looks like there's stuff built up here that's just discoloration at this point. But take your time, make sure things are smooth, otherwise you will go through a head gasket. The other thing too, though, with this burning oil, you know, I know I was saying I reuse stuff, so that could be the reason why. I don't know if that head was burning oil previously. The valve seals could be bad, head could be warped. There's multiple reasons why this could have been burning the amount of oil it was burning, but it's hard to tell exactly which without digging deeper into it. Before we open all this up and show you all the parts that we need, just wanted to point out how great of a company Tectonics Tuning is. I've ordered from plenty of other companies in the past, and the amount of effort that they put into packaging your stuff speaks volumes about them as a company. I already started cutting this open, but this was very tightly wrapped up in this paper, nice and neat, and then wrapped with this bubble wrap. We've got more stuff that, again, I started cutting it open, but everything's packed nice and neat and protected. You know, for example, the intake gasket is taped to a piece of cardboard so it doesn't get bent while shipping. These are my head bolts. Obviously, they're not worried about these getting damaged, but the fact that they wrap them in paper and bubble wrap shows that they don't want these damaging something else in your box. We've got seals, spark plugs, again, wrapped in cardboard or heavy-duty paper to prevent any damage while shipping. You know, Tectonics Tuning is the truth. Can't say it enough. So make sure where your head bolts are going to seat is nice and clean. Now, because I already had this head off last year, and the head gasket wasn't too old on it, this is already pretty clean. In most cases, when you go to take an old head off and it's got an old factory head gasket on it, or just an old head gasket in general, you usually find stuff built up here. You'll have to scrape it away with a razor and then follow up with Scotch-Brite. Go over the mating surface of the head, make sure it's free of anything. Don't have any raised pieces, anything stuck on there. Same thing goes for all your gasket mating surfaces, you know, the intake and exhaust gaskets. Usually not as bad with stuff built up on them, but always check them over. Got your coolant port, same thing, already went over that. This one's got some weird pitting going on with it, so when I go to put this on, I'm gonna have to use some RTV just to be safe, but I don't even know how that happens. Same thing with where your spark plugs sit. So the head is prepped, ready to go. Cam's torqued down, cam gear's torqued down. So you've got your new head gasket here. This head gasket in particular is marked down at the front, saying top. Check it over, make sure it's not kinked, cracked, bent, or anything weird going on with it. Make sure it goes on the right way. Most of these are marked accordingly. The ABA in particular will only go on one way. You've got that little dowel right there. Make sure you look in your cylinders that there's nothing that fell in, anything funky going on, any damage you didn't notice before. Take your head. The Mark 1 heads, I believe, have 2 dowels, so the gasket won't move. Right now on this ABA, the head gasket's pushed back a bit, but it's okay. Now, with anytime I've bought a head gasket, it comes with a guide here. It tells you the torque specs and the torque pattern. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there's 4 different steps you got to do it in. So make sure you check for this. If not, there they are. I'll freeze the video. 40 Newton meters, 60 Newton meters, 90 degrees, so a quarter turn, then quarter turn again. Do 40 Newton meters in this order: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You do 60 Newton meters in the same pattern, then you do 90 degrees, so quarter turn: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then the final step, same thing, quarter turn, 90 degrees, in that order. Very important. So, one of the great debates: should you oil your studs before you put them in or not? Personally, can't go wrong putting a little bit of oil on them. If you're using ARP hardware, this doesn't apply to you. That's a totally different technique. Make sure you do those right. I'm not a fan of those. Make sure you do those as ARP tells you to install them. Stock head bolts, yes, I personally oil them a little bit. Like I mentioned before, that head gasket shifted on us. You use one of the bolts, put it in, wiggle things around, everything will kind of line up and fall into place. You want to make sure everything's going together without binding. Got 40 Newton meters for the first step, which is about like 33 foot-pounds. So even though I've done this a ton of times, I still make sure I'm doing the right pattern. So next up, we've got 60 Newton meters for the second step, which is like 44 point something foot-pounds. This one is definitely more important. Take your time. Don't over torque anything. So now the fun part. You're gonna want a breaker bar. These last 2 steps are 90 degrees each, so a quarter turn. It's kind of hard to get it exactly sideways with the motor, so just do your best to do a quarter turn. Don't go using no Chinesium bullshit Harbor Freight special breaker bar or extension or bit. So just like that. Doesn't have to be 100% precise, you know, this thing isn't going to Mars. Just do your best to make it 90 degrees. Now for the last series, again, another 90 degrees. This one's the fun one. Just make sure that bit's seated all the way down, especially if there's oil in there, you know. Give it a good wiggle, make sure it's seated all the way down. That'll do it. Now your head is torqued down. So the next step, I feel like not too many people talk about, because it's not exactly necessary. You could get by without doing it, but if you have the means to, there's literally no reason not to do it, and that is prime the oil pump. We've got this homemade tool here. What this does is sits on top of the oil pump and allows you to spin it. I've made this, I don't know what this came out of, but I've made them out of push rods, old push rods in the transmissions. Got a slot in it yourself. But basically make yourself a tool that can fit on the oil pump. So what we're going to do is take the distributor out. Be mindful of where your distributor is, what orientation it's in, because you want to try to match it back up. It's a little tricky to get the distributor back in. It's not too bad, but just be mindful of where your plug is, where your top dead center mark is. Try to get the line up back where it was, because if you put it too far in either direction, you won't have adjustment when it comes to timing to setting your ignition timing. Now, the reason why this is tricky to put back in is because if you notice, as you pull it out, the cap will spin. So watch how much it spins as we pull it out. Straight up, it turned, you know, 1/8 of a turn past top dead center. So that's got the adapter ring on it, that's what inches pop out, but normally your distributor should just pull right out. Now you can see down in there, that's your oil pump. This little notch right there, that's your oil pump. I already drained my oil. Get yourself the largest, cheapest bottle of Rotella that your AutoZone or Walmart has. Go ahead and lather that sucker up. Oh yeah. It's God's nectar right there, Rotella. Rotella. Finish making a mess with your Rotella. So when you have a motor that's been sitting a long time, or you remove the head, chances are you're going to lose prime in your oil pump. Now you could just start the car once you're done and kind of rev it up a little bit and get it to catch and prime, but with a little bit of effort that this takes between making your tool, popping the distributor out, and priming the pump properly, you know everything's got oil that's supposed to have oil, and you're not going to run anything dry. Don't go in dry. Once you're done getting your Rotella everywhere but in the engine, get your tool, put it down there on the oil pump, and spin it clockwise. It'll go really easy, and then you'll feel it catch. You'll also hear it catch and bog down a bit. That's how you know it's primed. And if you do it long enough, you'll see oil come squirting up out of the lifters. And on a solid lifter head, I would say this isn't as important. Again, it's best if you can do it. Hydraulic lifter head, definitely suggest doing this. Take your time, go get the tools if you need to, but hydraulic lifters definitely definitely strongly recommend priming your oil pump. And all the oil starts squirting up from the lifters. It's as easy as that to start your engine like a gentleman. You might have to play with the intermediate shaft as you're trying to get things to line up. If you have to twist the distributor way out of line to get it to click in onto that notch on the fuel pump, it's fine because you can get some slack in the timing belt here and play with the intermediate shaft. Just be mindful that you will have to double check things as we go to do the final buttoning up of everything. This doesn't have to be exactly where you had it. You just want it somewhere in this general direction, or wherever it was for you. You just don't want it pointing in a totally different direction. So we're at the home stretch. Exhaust is bolted up, carbs are bolted back on. Got a couple other small things to put on, but now we're going to time the motor. This is obviously the most important part. Back to what we were saying at the start of the video, I like to make sure that I visibly see that piston number 1 at the very top there. Put on our new timing belt tensioner pulley. There is a special tool to tension these, but you really don't need it. You can literally use your hand to set the tension. If you have trouble, yes, there is a tool. You can get the tool. There's no shame in getting the tool. Just hit it with your purse first and then try to buy it. Looking down into cylinder 1, looking at the piston, and going back and forth to make sure it's at absolute top dead center. Rotate it clockwise until it comes all the way to the top and stops moving. Or you could get it so it just starts to go back down. Another technique you can use, take a screwdriver, put it in there so you're not looking down with a flashlight, but you can feel the top of the piston like that. It's gonna be hard to see in the video, but there's a point where it'll start coming up and then stop coming up and then start going down. You want to get it right when it's at that dead spot at the top. So this aftermarket cam gear has a notch that's also painted yellow now too, but there's a notch there and it's supposed to line up with the edge of the head right there. If you can see, it's too low, which means we're a tooth advanced on the cam timing. We'll move that back to tooth. Ignition timing. The distributor is at top dead center as well. So our crankshaft and intermediate shaft is where it's supposed to be, or more specifically our crankshaft and distributor is exactly where we want it to be, and we need to dial our cam back a tooth. The flywheel mark I don't bother with. Just my personal preference. You do use that as, if it is correct though, if everything lines up here and that lines up too on the flywheel, then you do use that to set your base ignition timing. I don't do either, because I use a timing gun to set my ignition timing. There's plenty of write-ups and links on Google for setting your ignition timing based off of your flywheel marks, so go ahead and look that up, but we're not going over that here. So again, we're a tooth advanced, so we're going to bring this back a hair. We'll bring it back one tooth, slide that belt back on. If you don't have the tool to tension this is the way to do it, literally by hand. You need a 19 and a 17. Take your 19. So we've got slack on the front here on the belt. Go counterclockwise just so you can pull this slack out. That's it. You don't want to turn the motor. It's not a big deal if you do turn the motor, but we're not trying to turn the motor at all. We're just trying to move the slack down to the pulley here. And at the same time, we're physically pushing this pulley inward to take the slack out. And then we could go ahead and crank down on that a bit and go rotate forward now and check our slack. Again, this isn't final, so we'll adjust this if we need to, but basically you want to be able to turn this about half a turn. You don't want it too tight, because then it'll walk one way, and if it's too loose it'll walk the other way, or worse, jump timing. Camshafts at top dead center, pistons at top dead center. Distributor, got that lined up now. It doesn't have to be perfect, because again, we're going to use a timing light to set the ignition timing to where it's supposed to be, but the engine is timed. Before we start the motor though, timing tensioner and pulleys nice and tight. Slack's good. Engine's correct time. She's alive. Just took it for a test drive. Everything's good to go. I have to set the ignition timing. It's just set at 0 right now, so I have to actually add some advance to it. But other than that, she's drivable right now. It's real straightforward as long as you don't run into any seized, stripped, rounded off bolts. Those are always going to be your biggest enemies with this job, because otherwise it's really simple. So that should about cover it as usual. If you guys have any questions, concerns, anything I'm wrong about, you just want to talk some shit, drop a comment below. Let me know what you guys think.